5, 4.
Hello everyone, hope you're all doing okay, and welcome to this second of our series of events to celebrate our 50th year as a systems group at the Open University. My name is Martin Reynolds. I'm representing the current incarnation of the group, which we now call ASTIP, the Applied Systems Thinking in Practice group. And I have the pleasure of hosting today's event with Glenda Ouyang, who joins us from her home in Minnesota. I'll introduce Glenda in a moment. Glenda will talk for around about 20 minutes or so, after which we'll open the platform for questions and discussions for around about 30 minutes. We'll then have some final closing remarks. The core Zoom platform being used today is limited to 100 people, and I know that many more are joining us through live streaming on YouTube and Facebook, so welcome everybody. Please feel free during the course of Glenda's talk to submit questions or points of interest through the chat functions on your Zoom, YouTube or Facebook. Questions will be picked up by our facilitating support team. The event is being recorded and will be made available on both Facebook and YouTube channels immediately following the event. Now, in order to make the recordings immediately available, we are somewhat restricted in allowing a live audio discussion with participants, so our apologies on that score and that limitation. Our facilitator for the discussion today is Barbara Schmidt-Abbey, who joins us from Dublin. Barbara is one of our part-time PhD students and is a senior evaluator with Eurofound. Barbara will be supported behind the scenes with fellow PhD student Huda Khayyam and our media support lead, Katrina Bray. After the discussion, my friend and ASTIP colleague, Dr. Rupesh Shah, will provide some brief personal reflections of the talk and discussion. Rupesh is an author on the postgraduate Systems Thinking in Practice program at the Open University, so I work quite closely with Rupesh. Rupesh will also give some notice of further 50th anniversary events. Just a quick notice on that. The next Jubilee event is now scheduled for the 22nd of June with Professor Mike Jackson speaking, and that's going to be hosted by our colleague Magnus Ramage. So Glenda, a very good morning and welcome. It's 6 o'clock in the morning in Minnesota, and the start of what I imagine might be a very long day ahead for people in Minnesota as they commemorate the anniversary, of course, of the killing of George Floyd. So on behalf of the systems group here and the wider Open University systems community, as well as other participants here today, can I just relay a message of support to you and your communities in Minnesota, supporting solidarity as part of the wider global community of Black Lives Matter, to which we all proudly belong. So Glenda and I first met some 15 years back in San Francisco, gathering of some 20 or so professional evaluators and systems thinking practitioners. The, excuse me a minute. The 5-day workshop was orchestrated with the capable hands of our good friend Bob Williams, who I know is joining us from New Zealand. Hello, Bob. The workshop resulted in the 2007 publication, Systems Concepts in Evaluation. At the time we first met, Glenda was already founding director of the Human Systems Dynamics Institute. The Institute has continued to grow, offering particular support around using ideas from complexity science and systems thinking. So Glenda now leads a global network of practitioners, of 800 actually scholar practitioners. They apply HSD to wicked problems ranging from early childhood education to violent extremism, public health, as well as corporate strategy. The work is based on 3 conditions that influence the dynamics of self-organizing change. They are containers, differences, and exchanges. This is a CDE model. More recently, Glenda has worked on ideas of adaptive action, something I regard as the methodological principles of applying CDE. and the ideas that informed the presentation today. So the title of Glenda's presentation today is Scale-Free Dissemination, Local Behaviour to Systemic Results. And using the simple questions of adaptive action, what, so what, and now what, Glenda will guide us through a way of understanding and improving efforts to work across different scales. Specifically, the challenge is one of bridging the divide between localized helpful individual behaviors and potential wider constructive systemic effects. So the current COVID-19 pandemic is being used by Glenda quite helpfully for illustration. Drawing on ideas from complexity disciplines, the presentation expands a little on the CDE model, a model that provides an organizing framework for structuring patterns. So I leave it with you in our audience to explore the relevance and resonance of CDE as an organizing principle to your own practice. For me, Glenda's work provides important touchstones in resonance with ideas of recursion and the ever challenging problems of dealing with variety. It also speaks to me of the enduring core ideas of systems thinking in practice, and that is the interplay between thinking systemically and thinking and acting systematically. Since San Francisco, I've had the great pleasure of working with Glenda on several occasions, both in America and here in the UK. It's always a great joy working with you, Glenda, and it's a great privilege now to invite you to speak. The platform is yours. Thank you.
Martin, thank you for that lovely introduction and for including me in this celebrative time for your program. It's hard to believe it's been 50 years, and it's interesting to reflect back on the things that were written and said and worked on 50 years ago and where we are now, in some ways far ahead and in some ways holding still the same questions that we did 50 years ago. So I'm very pleased today to spend some time with you with both the theory and the practice of human systems dynamics. And so we shall begin. The question that I had and have had since probably 15 years ago is this one about how we go from local change to global change. Sometimes we call it scaling up. I believe it's a major challenge. So that's what I want to focus on today. I'm going to begin with a what, thinking about what is the problem of change in complex systems, defining specifically what we mean in human systems dynamics when we say system. We'll also talk about, so what are some of the ways that we can influence that change in a complex system? And finally, what are some methods that come out of that approach that will allow us to scale local change into global change? And then we'll have lots of time for questions. So what's the problem of change in a complex system? I think Dr. Yen states it very clearly here. To study poverty, for example, without inequality leads to tendencies to misrecognize structural issues for individual failings. On the other hand, to study inequality without poverty is to allow for research devoid of humanity. It has seemed, with many models and methods and approaches, that it's a trade-off. Either we focus on local individual transformation, or we focus on systemic change. Many disciplines are arranged that way and structured in that way. And so how can we begin to think about each of those scales in a way that it becomes informative context rather than competition for the other? I want to begin by defining just what we mean when we say system. And in the US, as you probably know, systems thinking is pretty much defined as systems dynamics. Occasionally, you'll find alternatives. Those of you who have the perspective of living outside the United States recognize there are many. And we began, as we started looking at the link between systems and human systems, thinking about what approach to systems would be most useful. And this one became the one that has built the center of our work, complex adaptive systems. It says that there are agents that interact, and those agents may be individuals or memes or institutions. They can be concrete, physical, conceptual, social. They interact, and over time, they generate system-wide patterns, and those patterns can be political perspectives or culture or performance levels. And as those patterns emerge, they influence the behavior of the agents in later cycles. So on the one hand, this seems very simple. Agents interacting, generating patterns, and the patterns reinforcing behaviors in the systems. And it would be if that were all there were. But each of these agents is itself a complex adaptive system. And the emergent patterns engage with other emergent patterns to create complex adaptive systems at the next higher level. And so we might even say it's CAS all the way down. The way that that complicates our issues of decision-making and action in systems is based on this massive interdependency. So let's just imagine the case. There's one person who has COVID-19, and they're working in economic transactions and a system of economic interactions. And there's also physical contact with people they know and people they don't know. And there are social interactions that they have in place, in relationship, and there's a healthcare infrastructure into which they move, and there's the public health regulation and infrastructure in which they live and work, and that structures their environment. And then on top of that, there are national politics, which have been particularly cogent here in the US in this regard. And then there's the climate crisis, which lies above it all, opening the possibility and indeed the necessity for such viral growths to emerge, for pandemics, this one and future ones, to thrive. So in this space, how are we as thoughtful individuals to make decisions? What does it mean even to set a boundary, much less to challenge it? And it's in this space that we've evolved a way of thinking about patterns and seeing patterns and influencing patterns over time, which is our work. How do you see a pattern in a mess? How do you understand it in a useful way? And then how do you interact with it to shift the pattern over time? Now, in that process, we talk about scaling, and I just want to be clear about what we mean when we say scale. So we may say a scale, which would be a level of systemic interaction and structure in the complex system. A scale. We can also say to scale, which is the challenge of many of us as evaluators and as program developers and implementers. How do we take to scale a particular intervention? And finally, the idea of scale-free that emerges out of complexity that many of you may have seen in the idea of fractal structures, which is to say that self-similarity happens in all scales or at any scale, so that the system structure essentially is free of scale because it is replicated in all scales. So we use that word in those three ways, and I just wanted to clarify that. I'll be using it in all of those in the next few minutes. So what we found is that as we approach patterns in these complex systems, there are three patterns that inform our complex practice. One is inquiry, because we recognize that such systems, massively interdependent, open, high dimension, nonlinear, have to be unpredictable. They are essentially unpredictable. And so our role as interveners or as describers of these systems is to be in inquiry so that answers are emerging from the system in relationship, ongoing, a key feature. A second is, as Martin spoke about, adaptive action, so that the process, the method, is short and iterative. What's the current pattern? So what does it mean? Now what will we do? Every action shifts the pattern. So the next step is what? What, so what, and now what? And that's the method. And the third part, which is really the most unique contribution of HSD, is the idea of pattern logic. What are the conditions that influence the evolution of patterns in complex systems? And that's where I want to spend the rest of our time together. The roots of pattern logic come from many different complexity sciences. In each of these sciences and each of these disciplines, there are methods and approaches for working with complexity. And each of them has evolved a particular set of criteria and functions and questions that they hold. And in my work, I asked, what do they all have in common? In all of these different perspectives and all of these different ways of working with complex systems, what was at the core, what was essentially the same, what made this field scale-free? And what I discovered were that there are three conditions. Martin mentioned them. The container, which defines the focal system, and it can be whatever holds the agents together. It can be physical or social or emotional or conceptual. And in any human system, there are multiple and massively entangled containers. So when we talk about boundary critique, that's embedded in HSD in terms of seeing multiple containers equally valid. And then the choice is which one is the focal container. That's the C. The D in the CDE model is differences. So within any boundary, there are differentiations that hold the energy in the system. They also give meaning. And so in the same way as potential energy is held in a physical system through difference, in human systems, differences within boundaries, within containers, hold and are able to release energy for change and also give meaning. And again, those differences can either be kinds of difference or they can be degrees within particular differences. And finally, exchange. An exchange is the flow within the system that allows the release of the tension. It actualizes the potential energy that's held in the difference. And the flow can be, again, energy or material, can be information, any way that there is a resolution of difference in the system is an exchange. And again, relationships between people is the simplest way to think of it, but we also have flow of resources, flow of funding, flow of energy, flow of communication. And those can be either linear or nonlinear. So this very simple system, as you can see, has a great deal of variability built into it. And so the way that that builds a method is to say, if we look at the containers, now remember the container can be a boundary or a central attracting agent. It's possible that those containers are closed and small and very few. So the constraints in the system are high, which would make the system very predictable. Or the containers can be very open and large, there can be lots of them, in which case the system migrates toward a kind of randomness through the field of chaos and into randomness. You have the same kind of range and differences. When you have few and small and very permanent differences in a system, it tends to get stuck, stable, predictable, concrete. On the other end, where the differences are many and broad and unknown, the system begins to roil and the patterns are hard to see. And finally, exchanges. That if the exchanges are linear and tight and strong, and there are lots of them, the system gets locked in, and if they're loose, then the system is freer. And so you can think about this as degrees of freedom, low degrees of freedom on the left and higher on the right. And what this does gives us a map of possible system states. Now, recognizing that the system is moving back and forth, and it's in many states simultaneously. So this is within each individual container in the system, you have these dynamics going on. And we call that relationship a pattern. So you can have, at this extreme end of control and predictable, when you want to scale up, i.e. to take a solution from one locale into the larger space, expand it across a larger area, best practices are great. Simple enough. You can think about giving an injection. It's very simple, it's predictable. Everyone does it exactly the same way, whether you line up in cars or stand in line or stand 6 feet apart. When you get to the poke in your arm, it's going to be exactly the same every way. Low variability, high consistency, linear connections. And in those cases, best practices are lovely. Now, I know best practices have gotten a bad rap recently because we don't usually in human systems work with something that is this simple and predictable, or we've already solved it, so we don't worry about them. But this is one way when you're in the stable space to replicate and expand and scale up. If you go to the second scale, where patterns are recognizable, so you're beginning to get some degrees of freedom, but you can still recognize what's there and its influence is possible. In those cases, you can have a framework. And in our COVID experience, the framework has been things like the guidance that comes from the Centers for Disease Control or the WHO, where that is coming. Those are frameworks about what are the questions you look at, what are the things that you consider. Those are controllable to some extent. There's a limited number of scales that are involved. They're solid and clear containers. There's limited variability, though there's some freedom in the system, and power is distributed across those systems. So when you're in a condition where those things hold true, then frameworks are wonderful for taking local action to scale. If we go to the next area, the degrees of freedom are increasing. There's more variability in the system. It can be less predictable, less controllable, and simple rules are useful in that place. We think about simple rules as similar to what Michael Quinn Patton calls principles, but there's some critical distinctions. We can talk about that during the questioning if you'd like. But simple rules are a short list of action-based statements that determine local behavior toward coherent, system-wide, emergent patterns, simple rules. And we've seen those in COVID with the wear, wait, and wash, that the rules about personal hygiene to how to protect ourselves. At another scale, there's been system test and trace as verbs that determine behaviors, local detailed behaviors that are intended to create system-wide patterns of performance. And this is great when what you want is global coherence, but maximum local variability. Works when there's distributed power, when the relationships are nonlinear, when the agents have some choice of how to interpret and apply the simple rules over time. And so we've used this in many ways for scaling local behaviors out. We've used it in conflict situations and in healthcare situations, in education, and in public policy questions and issues around disaster response. Simple rules. And finally, when you come to a place where you're working in a system, and many of us are, where the boundaries are open, where there really is no way to know what the primary or independent variables are in the system, that all the variables seem dependent, and there are many of them, and different focus, different priorities of variables in different times and places, and the exchanges are nonlinear so that the changes move and change progresses at exponential rates. That in those situations, then the best choice is to use the CDE model, which will allow you to see the pattern in the moment. What are the current relevant containers? What are the current differences that make a difference? And what are the exchanges in the system at this moment? And with that kind of a picture of this moment, then the intervener can choose how to shift those conditions and influence the pattern emergent. So we've seen the CDE model work in many ways in the under our pandemic lockdown. So this father is holding his own container. Within it, there are certain differences that make a difference to him, and there are exchanges that are possible from that place that he stands. And we can say that this wedding party also is dealing with a container of sorts, differences that make a difference, and exchanges. And they're able to make choices in that frame, given what they understand about the work and space, the conditions under which they live and work. And as you can see, some of them are choosing the same things and some of them are choosing differently. Each one is considering their own C's and D's and E's, and the group as a whole is doing the same. We can also see that at an individual level about wearing a mask, or at a commercial level about the expectations, the way that a business manages its own C's and D's and E's. And finally, at the largest scale, the conservationists among you are aware of the ways in which the global container and issues of health and well-being and deforestation and illegal wildlife trade are differences and exchanges that are influencing the patterns that we know as the COVID pandemic. And so that's the way in which we can see the CDE model underlying the dynamics, helping us understand the dynamics for a variety of methods that will allow us to scale up. And that's the way that we think of it as scale-free dissemination, that we can, given a particular intervention, ask ourselves, what are its current conditions? Under those conditions, what is going to allow us to take the learning from one space and apply it in another in a way that it will be accepted and relevant in that place and time. And so these are 4 of the ways that we look at scaling up, and each one has its own method and approach. So those were our questions. What's the problem of change in a complex system? So what principles inform that systemic change? And what methods can be derived from that that will allow us to work at change across scales? And now I'm really looking forward to dialogue and conversation. Here are some resources that you may find helpful, and they are in your, these slides are available. We're happy to share them. And so I'm really eager to step into some questions and discussion.
Glenda, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Again, a wonderful presentation. Before I hand over to Barbara to facilitate, I suspect, quite a lot of questions that are coming up, I just wanted to kick off with one particular question. And it's around the idea of framing, because, of course, the CDE itself is a framing device. And there's a whole bunch of questions about the CDE model and it's how it compares with other framing devices that are knocking around out there. And in particular, I'm sort of interested in the resonance that it has with things like critical systems heuristics and indeed the viable system model, as well as rich pictures, actually. There are other things that I've just noticed in the chat as well with regards to Derek Cabrera's DSRP framing and the Knafin framework by Dave Snowden. So there, there's a whole lot of questions about the relevance of the framing device. What I'm interested in is how is the wider framing of that you're now using in including with the other 3 methods. So CDE is one sort of way of framing, and I just wonder whether you may be selling yourself a little bit short with CDE. I'm not sure. But isn't it much more accurate to sort of look at situations, any situation, as being volatile before we start framing it? It's going to be volatile. It's going to have all these kind of complications, complexities, conflicts, and so prior to any framing device, I mean, there's volatility out there, and it seems to me that if you're suggesting that other methods which assume that there's not that volatility, it can be legitimizing those particular practices, and in particular best practice, I guess, it does come out as quite a thing. So perhaps you could just address that question. Thanks.
It's really fascinating, Martin. Yes, indeed. Human systems are always at many scales in many ways and very volatile and surprising, and even an individual, much less a team or a community, is going to be volatile. I appreciated your reference to Black Lives Matter, which is itself a complex, emergent system. And at any moment, it can be incredibly volatile. That's true. And one of our passions in HSD is about use. We're pretty pragmatic. And so to say, yes, it's true that everything is volatile and open, and what's useful. And so to be able to use the CDE to zoom in on whatever in a moment, given the power, given the urgent challenges, given the level of information you have, to zoom in to a particular framing in a particular moment, but recognizing all the time that that's not the only, may not be the best, and that you can't even control the future in it. And so it's this balance between true and useful that we try to work with. One of the things that makes CDE helpful is that it's so simple that you can apply it in a moment. And it's also flexible. Now, that's both a blessing and a curse, because if you're given a volatile, complex, messy space, there's no limit, literally no limit, to the number of ways you can represent that system. And so the choice has to be made by an individual person in the context of that system, in the question about what is possible. That's why adaptive action has action in it. I don't know if that responds to the question that you have, but it's the way that we look at that challenge. And what we want to do is to have the constraints that come to our understanding and action. We want those to be constraints that we find in the system as much as possible, not that we impose upon the system. And so that's why we stand in inquiry, is that we're looking at what are the C's and D's and E's that we see in the system so that we can leverage them in choices for action, as opposed to coming along with our picture of what a pattern might be and expecting the system to align to that predetermined pattern.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Glenda. I think we could probably talk for another couple of hours just between two of ourselves on that. But,
hope we do.
We do. Let me hand over now, though, to Barbara, because I think there's probably quite a number of questions arising.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Glenda, for a very inspiring talk. And indeed, there are a number of questions pouring in from our listeners. And just to remind everyone, please type in your questions in the chat boxes, whichever platform you are. We are compiling them and aiming to ask as many as we can. So keep them coming. So we have a number of questions here from Zoom. We have, for example, the question from Andrew: how does the framing mechanism device account for the influence of human heuristics, e.g. confirmation bias, defensive routines, failure to account for causes separated by time lags, etc., and how the system and the scale is bounded? Glenda.
Hi, Andrew, and thanks a lot. That's why the pattern logic doesn't stand on its own. The process of adaptive action is a self-correcting mechanism, so that whatever frame you have initially may include your biases, certainly does. The so what is making sense of it and action. And if your biases do not hold true to the system, then the what is going to, over cycles, give that clarity to you, so that the adaptive action is constantly challenging whatever your old assumptions were. So that's its self-correcting mechanism. We also find in doing the adaptive action that you often have to shift the boundary, shift the container, that you find that your current definition is too narrow. So the next time you have to expand it, or you find that you're working in too large a container and you need to shrink it. And so varying even the system boundaries is an open possibility in adaptive action.
Very nice. Thank you. Thanks, Glenda. So we have another question here from someone in the Zoom chat. Glenda, do you have any examples of where you have used this approach and the outcomes of that? Please, can you share any of this?
Yes, indeed. So just one quick story. It comes from healthcare in Canada. Access and flow is a major issue in almost every healthcare delivery system, and certainly during COVID it was worse. And the effect is that people are coming into the emergency room for treatment, and there aren't beds for them to go to. And so the emergency room becomes a holding tank for people, and that was particularly a problem during COVID. And there have been many many approaches to this problem. It is what we call a wicked problem. There seems not to be a single solution to it, no final solution. And so it's a wicked problem, and we move in with adaptive action. And the woman who was in charge of both innovation at this health authority in British Columbia realized that it was a wicked problem, and she had tried everything that was possible and feeling more and more urgent. And so in thinking about it as a complex adaptive system, she realized that there were many containers involved and many decision makers, and that each decision maker was working within a different pattern within a different container. And so she sent out a message that said, anybody who has anything to do with access and flow, come to this meeting. So about 85 people showed up, and she said to each of them, look, you've got a boundary within which you're working. There are differences that you can control and ones you can't, and there are connections that you're playing with, C's and D's and E's. What can you do to make the pattern better? What is one thing you can do to change the C or change a D or change an E to make it better? And she let them go. And they came back the next week, and access and flow had improved by 10%. And they shared their stories. And then I went out another week and came back, and it was even better. So each of them was running their own adaptive action cycles, given what they knew about the system in the places where they were. And so some of those systems were permanent and were embedded in infrastructure. Others were local and just used in that moment. And so that over time, they showed a major improvement in access and flow, which was a problem that had been there for a very long time. And you can see how that is working at individual scales of decision-making, local problem interaction with client scales, institutional scales and processes, and institutions as a whole. That gives lots of the facets. I hope that's an example that makes sense quickly.
Oh, that's a great story that illustrates the use, the application of this, Glenda. I think this answers the question very well. So we have another question here. Have you found the CDE framework useful as a way of helping non-systems thinkers participating in the system to understand their own participation? Is it shared with participants, or is it used by the practitioner?
It's a great question. So in addition to practice, one of our passions is about simplicity. We believe that people who are embedded in complex systems need to act in the moment, in the places where they are. And so a distraction of having to go through a loop of systems analysis back into their practice, they simply don't have the bandwidth or time or energy for that. And so what we try to do is to take the CDE, thinking of it as a high-level abstraction, and to create mid-level abstractions that are much closer to the way that people think and talk about things, so that they can touch the CDE, but through language that's much more common for them. And so given those tools, we find ways for people to work pretty easily in their own language. An example is Brenda Zimmerman's STAR model for generative relationships. And it's a teaming model that talks about 4 things that you need to do with the team. You need to look at their similarities and differences. You need to look at their talking and listening, at the authentic work that they do, and their reason for being together, STAR. And essentially that's a mid-level abstraction of the CDE, or the DEC in practice and C in theory. And so we use those kinds of tools that embed the CDE, but in language that's very accessible. And yes, we found it to be really very commonsensical to people. There's something fundamentally intuitive about the application of CDE.
Wow, that answers this question very well too. Thanks, Glenda. The questions are greatly flowing in here, so keep them coming. There is one from Ray. How conducive are the circumstances in Minnesota and the US more generally for institutionalizing your approaches within governance policy systems?
Oh my goodness, what a great question. What we have found, and this is generally true across the complexity discipline, is that in any system, there are a few people on the edge who see the need for the paradigm shift. They are aware of the anomalies that are coming. They are seeing that they're not able to solve using old tools, and they are ready for a new and this radical of a paradigm shift. And they come quickly and with great relief. Unfortunately, they are on the edges often. Even if they're in the middle, they've been marginalized. And so it's the dissemination inside the system that has been challenging. On the other hand, when working with a federal agency, which we are right now, we've sent out a call to say, if there's anybody in this large agency who is ready for a paradigm shift or has problems they're stuck with or can't move forward, come to a quick meeting. Let's see if this will work. And so what we're hoping is that those interested people at the edge, we can bring together into a community of practice. So it's an ongoing question. It's an ongoing question. Individuals move into it quickly. Systems move into it more slowly. One of the challenges is that we've found people who are habituated to power are less able to see the pattern than those of us who have been without power for a long period of time and have had to manipulate systems and patterns without power. And so one of the things that we're working on now is how to help people with power and privilege begin to see patterns more deeply and to respond to them with more responsibility and thoughtfulness. So it's a journey. It is not an easy path.
Great. Thanks, Glenda. Here, more questions for you. Andrew Knight is asking, would you be able to expand on the application of your illegal wildlife trade example, please? This is a very complex challenge.
Oh, Andrew, thank you very much. I should let you answer that question. The way in which we were thinking and talking about that was to try to see strategy and building strategy in the conservation world to respond to the pandemic. Post-COVID strategy was what the question was. And so we stretched to think about the globe as the container and the differences that make a difference on economic terms, social terms, health status terms, health systems terms, and the exchanges, of which wildlife trade is one, and to use the CDE to zoom in to try to see the patterns in a way that they would be useful, where there would be options for action. And that's still underway. I'd love to talk with you some more about it, Andrew, because each person who's involved in conservation has some touch in some place on that pattern. And the leverage of it really depends on the information someone has at that moment in time.
Great, thanks, Glenda. Another question here is, as a HSD practitioner, I do use CDE with participants who are non-systems thinkers, and it is very useful alongside adaptive action. I tend to use the language of similarity, difference, and connection as a less technical languaged way of exploring CDE and identifying patterns. I think this might be a comment more than a question. But the next question after that, would love to hear more about the flow and access issues in healthcare, as it is a major issue here as well. Is this published as a case study at all?
It is not published as a case study, but I can tell you that we're doing some work with the NHS using HSD in leadership. So how can leaders see it for decision making, and also for wicked issues as they're appearing today in healthcare delivery. So looking at decision making and accountability under conditions of COVID. Each of those cases is unique because they're working on different issues in different places and different times. And so the process is so simple. So to say where you are, whatever your role is, what's the pattern that you see in this moment? And to be brutally honest about that. So what are the options that are open to me, given what I know and the power that I have, and do it, and then learn from that to the next one. So the response to access and flow, one of the things that Tracy, the woman who ran that research, one of the things she realized was that each of those people had a different solution. And so that access and flow is not a singular problem to be solved. It is an emergent pattern to be shifted. And that was the distinction really that put her in a different place with regard to things. So this distinction between problem to solve and pattern to shift is the distinction and paradigm that we're looking at, that the CDE allows you to say, I can shift this pattern even though I cannot solve this problem. I'm not in control of it. The system is going to overcome any intervention that I try to make, but I can shift that pattern with my action. So that, I guess, is the most core thing. If you think about access and flow as a pattern and not as a problem, you'll get farther along. We also did some work in Northern England with poverty, looking at poverty not as a problem, but as a pattern in a particular locale. And that conversation really generated some pretty innovative responses to working with poverty.
Great, thanks, Glenda. There were also some questions earlier on about where your work is published. So similar to the question about the case study, if one wanted to quote your work, what can one refer to? Where can we find it being published? Question.
As you can imagine, and many of you probably have this trouble too, getting published in academic journals is difficult if you're transdisciplinary work. And so we have associates who have published in international relations and in education and in healthcare and in medical education and in public policy. And each of them has embedded HSD in the language that they use in that discipline. The best journal that I've been able to publish my work in is E:CO, Emergence, Complexity in Organizations. And it's a theoretical practitioner journal that focuses on complexity. And it's a really interesting and useful journal, but it's the place where many of my things have been published. We also brutally realized that one of our colleagues says, I don't know who wrote the first book about printing, but it was not Gutenberg. So in some ways, we have not taken the time and focus and investment in writing our research as we should have done. And so much of what we have done is in small pieces that are practice-oriented for end users. And those are on our website. And we have a searchable website that has about 500 items on it, webinars and blog posts and white papers and tons of things that are there. So they are not peer-reviewed, but it is a rich font of work that lives there.
We have lots of requests here for the link for
All right.
your website.
Shall I put it in chat or shall we send it later?
I think Katrina is, we're trying to share it. We find ways of sharing.
Thank you.
That will be taken care of. So maybe we go back to some more questions to cover. We have maybe 5 minutes time. As the message is as STEM email, we will share that to everyone interested. So another question from Alberto, a very interesting talk. Glenda, do you see a similarity between CDE and frameworks developed in the UK systems communities, such as SOSM, Mike Jackson, and they're the ones that Martin mentioned before, which indeed came up here in the chat, which was mentioned was DSOP and
Oh, of course, there's similarities. We're all struggling to describe the same phenomena. And so absolutely there are similarities. And there are also critical differences about how we frame the question we're trying to solve. And I've long since stopped trying to say which one is better or which is worse. My question is which is most fit for function in a particular time and place. And the places where CDE is most fit for function is where practice is the focus. So understanding the system is a means toward practice, not the other way around. Where the work that needs to be done is way out on that far from equilibrium, far from stability part of the spectrum. And where what you need is to have an explanation of how and why something is happening, not just what is happening. And so a description of what you see and then simply a random response to that is much different than thinking about the mechanisms of the dynamics of the CDE and being choiceful, even you predict or control, being choiceful about moving in. My dear friend, whose name of course has left me in this moment, wrote Collapse of Chaos, said, you know, Glenda, it's like we're all talking about love and we're walking around it and pointing at it and trying to describe that thing that we know is. But some of us are writing haiku, some of us are writing 600-page novels, some of us are speaking in dance, but we're all talking about the same thing. We choose the language that fits our discourse communities, that fits our methodologies and practice and goals, but we're all talking about the same thing. So if anybody's interested, I'd love to talk about the detailed distinctions between and among those, but maybe that's for another conversation.
Great. And here we have another question, similar question, which may be similar or not. Maybe you can tell how does CDE and your use of the term human system dynamics relate to the discipline of system dynamics, Forrester?
We're all talking about systems. The Forrester's work is a very specific set of containers, very specific set of differences, and very specific set of exchanges. And so I see it as a special case of the CDE, and a very useful one, a very informed one, a really powerful one, and a special case.
Right. Okay, we are actually running out of time quite rapidly. So maybe just to summarize, if you have if people have any requests, please email stem-communications@open.uk at open.ac.uk, and that we will be organized. Yeah, just comments. The final comment here from the chat is, sounds like a great conversation sometime. Could you set that up on HSD or another channel? Would love to learn about some of the differentiations and how this relates to the fit for practice. So maybe we leave this as a final remark or question from the floor.
Yeah, that's great. And I would like to say two things. One is that we have a totally open intellectual property policy, so that we simply ask people to cite the source and to teach back as they use things. So please, we'll be distributing the slides. Feel free to use them. And the second thing is we have communities of practice within the HSD community that convene to talk about a variety of things. Email me, drop a note to info@, and we'll set up a time to talk. I would treasure that.
Wonderful. And maybe this is probably given the time, we probably have to close the questions from the audience section now, and apologies to anyone whose questions we couldn't answer due to time. Now I would like to hand over to Rupesh for his final remarks.
Hello, hi. I hope you can hear me well. Glenda, thank you for that talk. That was really wonderful and really full of some inspiring ideas. And thank you everybody else for your attention and your contributions. You know, without your attendance and participation here, this wouldn't be much of a seminar. So it's really great to have so many of you with us today. I'm just going to conclude today's seminar with a few thoughts of my own in relation to Glenda's work on adaptive action and scale-free dissemination. And then I'm going to share some information about some future events that are coming up for the systems community. You know, when I first came across your work, Glenda, it was actually probably 10 or 15 years ago, and I probably wasn't even aware that it was, you know, that you who was doing this, but it was when I was working as a community development practitioner. And at the time, we were struggling to know how to engage various groups of stakeholders, volunteers, community activists, and participants in thinking about the impact of our work together. Most of these people didn't have a background like in evaluation, but were struggling with everyday problems, like you talk about, the practice problems in their lives. And so when I came across the framework of what, so what, now what, it felt like such an elegant solution to a way of opening up questions about evaluation within our community work, you know. So so I'm firstly just want to say thank you for making, you know, such an elegant framing device for you know, practitioners out there, and that was when I was working as very much as a practitioner in the foreground, and I had attention to, you know, intellectual ideas in the background, but my foreground was the practice work on the ground. So, and now sort of moving into a sort of in-between role where part of my role is as an educational manager and part of it is an academic, I see the relevance of what you're talking about very much every day. And it's been really nice to have this opportunity this last few weeks, you know, to be thinking about your event and reading a bit more and deepening my appreciation of it. And like many others today, I think, you know, I've really noticed some similarities between your framework and various other frameworks out there. You know, I think a couple of people have mentioned some of those. Canafin, they've been mentioned. There's a parallel in our current teaching at the Open University, which draws on the work of Ray Eisen and Ed Straw, who sort of we introduce a framework that draws on work with the UK Environment Agency, and very much it's kind of moving from what we call DAD, or what was called DAD, Decide, Act, Defend, towards EDD, which is Engage, Deliberate, Decide. So I think it's a similar sort of pattern. There's two slightly amusing or interesting parallels that I'd like to still share with you right now. One of the most startling parallels that came up for me that I noticed was between the CDE framework and the work of mathematical cosmologist Brian Swimmy and cultural historian Thomas Berry. I don't know if you're familiar with their work on the universe story. Well, there you go. So, I mean, you know, when I noticed the difference between the CDE model and their work on sort of characterizing three features of sort of the evolution of the cosmos, I thought, well, okay, there's something, you know, something interesting going on here. So at some future point, I'd really love to have a conversation with you about, you know, how you, whether those were conscious connections or whether you stumbled across those. You know, it's really interesting. But there's also a slightly amusing connection that I made as well, which, you know, I think maybe there's a Disney princess out there that has got hold of your framework. Yeah, so I have two young daughters, and I spent far too much time watching Frozen movies. And in Frozen 2, Princess Anna finds herself in a tricky situation. And having lost all hope, she's not knowing, she doesn't know what to do, and suddenly she starts singing. And it's a bit of a dark moment in the movie. She's like, I've seen the dark before, but not like this. And it's cold out there and it's empty. Hello, darkness. And then she's ready to kind of give up. And then the song goes into Do the Next Right Thing. So there you go. Adaptive action by Glenda in Frozen 2. But, you know, this is all, I mean, you know, it's an amusing joke, but I think the thing that is coming up for me in making all these comparisons with different frameworks and you know, stories about, you know, how we manage complexity. One of the things that's coming up for me is about us as practitioners. And so we've not talked a lot about exactly the qualities of that a practitioner brings to these various frameworks. So, you know, in our teaching at the OU, we think about there's a sort of question of enactment, you know, so we can come up with plenty of ideas and models and frameworks, and really nice, simple, elegant ones like the ones that you've got. But I think the question I've got is, what are the qualities of being, doing, and loving that practitioners bring to these frameworks, like simple rules, that help them bring them alive in real life situations in ways that we value, you know, because I think you can see sort of frameworks like simple rules out there, but being brought alive in completely, perhaps in not quite the right way. So and that really, I think when you talked about the relationship between power and the ability to perceive patterns, I think there's something really fascinating in that, you know, that you know, the more power you have, perhaps the harder it is to see patterns. So I'm really curious about, anyway, the quality of the practitioners, individual and as a group, as a community, and how they make a difference to how a framework like CD is enacted. And as an educator, then the next question for me is a related set of questions about bringing these qualities into our learning. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I need to wrap up and do the next right thing here, which is like the next right thing for everybody here would be to sign up to another systems event. So we've got a couple more announcements to make. We've got 2 more events in this series of 50 years celebrations of teaching systems at the OU. We've got an event on the 22nd of June, which Martin has already mentioned, with Mike Jackson, and then another one on the 23rd of July with Dr. Sharon Pollard. So keep those dates in your diary. We should have more information on the STEM website about those. And then a couple more events outside of the OU, which serve as reminders of the recent loss of Humberto Maturana. On 25th of May, Pillay Bernal will be remembering Maturana in an online CyberSOC seminar. And then between the 8th and 13th of July, the International Society for System Sciences will be holding their annual conference online on the art and science of the impossible. And I think we're also awaiting announcement from Glenda about taking on the role of Anna in the forthcoming Ice Dance version of Frozen. You'll be reprising your favorite hits of leveraging uncertainty and what, so what, now what. Listen, thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. Without your enthusiasm and active engagement, we wouldn't be able to mark 50 years of learning about systems at the OU. So thank you very much, everybody.